The dish was still on the railing when I came outside that evening. I had not made a decision about it. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the weeks that followed, the thing I could not quite account for. 11 months after Della died, and I was still walking to the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator every evening around 4:30, still opening the paper bag of black oil sunflower seeds we kept there, still carrying a small scoop of them out to the shallow clay dish she had set on that railing 9 years ago. I had not decided to keep doing it. I had simply kept doing it, the way you keep reaching for the wrong side of the bed in the dark, the way your hand still moves toward a phone number you can no longer dial. If you've had a season like that one, you already know something about what I'm going to describe. And if you haven't, I want you to stay with me, because I have thought a long time about whether to tell this part of it, and I've decided the telling matters. I need to go back to the beginning of that November, to explain why I was standing on that porch at dusk in December, and what I was looking at, and why it was the first time in nearly a year that something inside me had come even part-way loose. My name is Travis Coleman, and I spent 31 years carrying mail on a rural route in a county in the northern Appalachians, which means I know what weather looks like before it arrives, what a road looks like when it's about to close, and what a piece of land tells you when you've been watching it long enough. I retired 3 years ago, 61 years old last August, with a 12-acre piece of property that is half open yard and half mixed hardwood, a house that Della and I had paid off together in the last year before she got sick, and a 9-year-old beagle named Burl, who had been hers first and was mine now, in the way that a plant becomes yours when the person who grew it is no longer around to water it. Della died in late October of last year. She was 58. We had been married 34 years. The illness was fast, which people kept telling me was a mercy, and I kept nodding because I knew they meant it kindly, and I did not have the energy to explain what it had actually felt like from the inside, which was not merciful, which was like a door closing before you could get your coat on. She had been the one who started the birdseed ritual, Della had. She had read somewhere that late-season birds needed the extra fat from the sunflower seeds before the cold settled in, and she had bought that brown-glazed dish at a church sale and set it on the porch railing and filled it every evening at 4:30 as regular as a clock. She talked to the birds the way some people talk to houseplants, not expecting an answer, just maintaining the connection. Cardinals, mostly. A pair of white-breasted nuthatches who came so regularly, she had named them, though she would not tell me what she called them because she knew I would tease her about it. I teased her about a lot of things she was right about. After she was gone, I went through October in a way I can only describe as procedural. I fed Burl at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. I drove to the hardware store in town on Tuesdays, because that was when I used to drive to town for the mail route, and my body expected a route. I did not sit in the chair she had kept near the front window because it faced out into the yard, and the yard at dusk looked different to me than it used to. I ate at the kitchen table, but I ate standing up, or I ate at the counter, which I am sure said something about where I was, though I couldn't have told you what. The first evening I filled the birdseed dish in November, I was not thinking about Della, or I was thinking about her the way you always are when you've lost someone, which is underneath everything, a low-frequency weight that you have stopped distinguishing from normal gravity. My hand went to the cabinet. My hand took the scoop. My feet carried me to the porch in the cold, and I shook the seeds into the dish, and Burl came out with me and sat on the porch step, and we both watched the yard for a minute in the grey evening light before I went back inside. I did not notice, the first few mornings, that the dish was empty. Birds empty a dish fast in November. We have deer mice in the hardwoods who would take seed in the night if I let them, though the railing was high enough to discourage them. I assumed birds. Chickadees come in numbers when the cold sets in, and they cache seeds, and they can move through a small dish in an hour if they hit it at the right time. I told myself that, and I believed it, and I went on refilling the dish each evening. It was the third morning in the third week of November when I first actually stopped and looked at the dish after I found it empty. What I noticed was that there was no scatter. When birds feed from a dish, they make a mess. They crack hulls and drop them. They scratch with their feet. They knock seeds over the edge in the process of getting at other seeds. I have watched birds feed from that dish for 9 years, first with Della watching beside me and then alone. And the scatter pattern was as familiar to me as the wear pattern on my truck's steering wheel. The hulls go over the left side of the dish mostly because of how the birds approach from the maple tree on that side, and there is always a dusting of shell fragments on the railing surface around the dish. The third morning in a row that I found the dish empty and the railing surface clean, I stood there for a while in the cold with my coffee, and I went through possibilities in the careful, methodical way I approach anything I can't immediately explain. Raccoon, I thought first. Raccoons will clean a dish thoroughly. But the dish had not been moved, and raccoons move things. They are dexterous and they are curious and they tip and turn and sometimes carry, and the dish was sitting exactly where I had put it. A large bird, I thought next. A crow or a raven working the seed before the small birds arrived. But I had not seen any large corvids on the property that season, and even a raven scatters hulls. Something was taking the seeds whole. Something was taking them cleanly, without disturbing the dish, without leaving any evidence of how it had reached the railing. I told myself there was an explanation I hadn't thought of yet, and I refilled the dish, and I went inside. That was the point in the story where a younger version of me would have set up a trap, or called it done. When I was in my 30s, I had a practical relationship with anomalies, which is to say, I pursued them until I had an answer, or until they stopped occurring, and I let the matter rest either way. But I was 61 years old, and it was my first winter alone on that 12 acres, and the dish had been Della's, and I'm being honest when I tell you that something in me did not entirely want to find the straightforward explanation. The dish being visited felt, in a way I did not examine directly, like company. Like something in the dark yard was participating in the ritual she had started. I know how that sounds. I am telling you anyway. The Friday before Thanksgiving, I found the tracks. Burl had gone to the door before first light, which was not unusual for him. He was a dog with a bladder that did not respect the season. I let him out and stood in the doorway in my socks and watched him go down the porch steps and around the side of the house. And then I noticed he had stopped at the base of the porch steps rather than going on into the yard. He had his nose down, and his tail was going slow and steady, the way it does when he's found something that interests him without alarming him. Not a rabbit, which gets his tail faster and his feet moving. Something larger from the way he was working the scent in a slow, deliberate circle. I put my boots on without lacing them and went down the steps. The frost was heavy that morning, maybe 30 degrees overnight, and it had set the ground surface hard enough to hold an impression. There were 3 clear prints in the frost at the near edge of the porch, running from the direction of the tree line and stopping at a point directly below the railing where the dish sat. The prints were large. I say large the way I say it when I mean something specific, not the way people say it when they mean impressive. I set my boot beside the nearest one, and my boot is a size 11, and the print was longer than my boot by perhaps 3 inches, and wider across the ball by the same amount. The stride was long enough that I had to take 3 of my own steps to cover what one of those strides had covered. They did not look like bear. I know what bear prints look like. I had seen black bear sign on this property 3 different years, and bear prints in soft ground have a distinct claw registration and a heel shape that these did not have. These were more linear, more bilateral, and they were deep despite the hard frost, which told me about weight. I stood there for a long time with my coffee cooling in my hand and my unlaced boots, and Burl sitting beside me with his ears forward and his tail still going that slow, steady rhythm. And I ran through the list of things that could have made those prints, and I got to the end of the list and the prints were still there. I went back inside. I made a second cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, which I almost never did, and I looked out the window at the yard for a while. I did not stop filling the dish. You have to understand something about the way I am built to make sense of that decision, or the thing that was functioning as a decision. I had spent 31 years driving a rural route, and the route had a logic to it, and the logic did not change, because the weather did. You drove the route in the rain, and you drove it in the snow, and you drove it on the mornings when you would have preferred to stay in bed, and the route got done. Della's birdseed dish had become something like a route for me. It had a time, it had a physical action, it had a result, which was that the dish was full when the evening settled in, and whatever had been visiting the property in the night could find something there when it arrived. I am not saying I had decided that was acceptable. I am saying I had not decided anything. My hands were filling the dish, and my feet were carrying me to the porch, and I was going back inside, and that was what November was. My daughter May called on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. She lived 2 hours south in a bigger town, and she called irregularly, which I understood to mean she was worried about me in a way she did not know how to express directly, because that is a family trait we share. I picked up this time, which I had not always been doing. We talked for about 12 minutes. She asked if I was eating, which I was, and if I was getting out of the house, which I was, in the sense that I was going to the hardware store on Tuesdays. She told me she was thinking about driving up for a few days after the new year. I said that would be fine. When I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. There was more I could have said to her. There has always been more I could have said to May, going back years. And I have not said most of it because the saying of it requires a particular kind of opening up that does not come naturally to me. Della had been the one who said the things that needed saying between me and May. With Della gone, there was a silence between my daughter and me that I did not know how to fill, and that I could feel getting heavier with every call I kept short. I was still thinking about that call on the Wednesday evening when I saw the shape at the tree line. It was just past 4:30, the dish was full, and I was standing on the porch for the usual minute before going back inside. The light in late November at that latitude is specific, a sort of failing gold that lasts about 20 minutes before it goes grey and then dark. And I had always liked that light, even though I liked it less than I used to. I was looking out toward the hardwoods at the back edge of the property, maybe 90 feet from where I stood, when I registered something in my peripheral vision that did not match the tree line. I did not turn my head fast. That was instinct from 31 years of driving. You do not look fast at things in your peripheral vision when you're moving, because looking fast changes what you're looking at. I turned slow, and by the time my eyes had moved to where the shape had been, there was nothing there that I could fix, just the tree line, the pale vertical lines of the ash and oak and the darker mass of the hemlock further back, and the failing light going grey between the trunks. What I had seen before I turned was a vertical mass. That is the only word I have for it. Not a horizontal mass the way a bear stands, not the low-moving shape of a deer. Vertical and large, in the same way a standing man is vertical, except that the scale was not the scale of a man. The silhouette I had caught at the edge of my vision had been tall enough that it had registered against the mid-trunk of an ash tree that I knew from walking past it to be about 15 feet to the first branch. I stood on the porch for a few more minutes in the cold. Burl came to the door and I let him out, and he went down the steps and stood at the yard's edge and raised his nose, and his tail went that same slow, steady rhythm. And he did not bark, and he did not raise his hackles, and he did not do any of the things that 9 years of living with him had taught me to expect when he was in the presence of something that worried him. Then he came back to the porch steps and sat down beside me. I want to be honest about what I felt in those days between the first glimpse and the full encounter. I did not feel frightened. I want to be clear about that. I had been frightened by things in my life, by the real things, and whatever was moving on the edge of my property at dusk did not feel like a threat. It felt like a tension. I know that is a strange way to put it. I am putting it that way because it is the most accurate language I have. What I did feel was something I had a harder time naming, a kind of low-frequency alertness that I had not felt since October. A reason to stand on the porch for the full 20 minutes of that failing gold light, instead of going back inside after 1 minute. I started going out a little earlier each evening. Not by much, 10 minutes maybe. I told myself I was just getting air. I know that was not the whole truth of it. The first week of December came in cold. We had a hard frost most nights, the kind that put a skim of ice on the water bucket I kept on the porch for Burl. I found one more set of large prints on a Tuesday morning, this time along the left side of the yard where the ground was softer near the old drainage ditch, and these were even clearer than the first set. I measured the length of one print against my forearm because I did not have a tape measure on me, and it was longer than my forearm by the width of my palm. I did not take a photograph. I am aware that says something about where I was. I called my brother-in-law Ray that evening, Della's younger brother, who had been out to visit twice since October, and who had more tolerance for the kinds of conversations I could not have with May. I told him I had been finding large tracks on the property. "What kind of large?" he said. "Larger than bear," I said. There was a pause. "You setting a trail camera?" "Haven't got one," I said. "You want one?" I thought about that for a moment. I said I'd let him know. I did not call him back about the trail camera. I am still not entirely sure why. Partly it was that I am 61 years old, and the learning curve on trail camera equipment was not something I was motivated to climb that particular December. Partly it was something else that I am willing to name but not willing to make too much of, which was that setting a camera felt like a different kind of relationship with whatever was out there than the one that seemed to be developing on its own. The evening it all came together was the 14th of December. I know the exact date because I checked the calendar after, the way you check the date on a document that matters. It was a Thursday. The temperature had dropped to 26 degrees by late afternoon, and the sky was the colour of old pewter, the kind of sky that holds the last light flat and cold and almost bright before the dark comes in fast. I had gone out at 4 o'clock, half an hour early, with the seed scoop and my barn coat and Burl behind me. I filled the dish. I set the scoop on the railing beside it. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets. Burl went down the steps and sat at the edge of the yard, not facing the house, facing the tree line. His tail was still and low, and his ears were forward, and I noticed all of this before I noticed anything else, because I have learned over 9 years to read Burl the way I read weather. Then I looked up, and the shape was there. It was standing at the tree line, not inside it, not half concealed the way it had been in the November glimpse. Standing at the edge where the yard met the first trees, fully visible in the flat pewter light, and it was still in the way that something is still when it has chosen to be still. Not the stillness of something frozen in surprise, but the stillness of a presence that has arrived and is waiting. It was enormous. I say that without exaggeration, Having spent 31 years delivering mail to rural addresses where I encountered every large animal this part of the Appalachians carries. The scale of it was wrong for everything I had a category for. 8 feet, maybe more, shoulders broader than the width of my front door, and covered in fur that was dark but not black, the colour of old bark in wet weather. The light was failing, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Burl had not moved from his spot at the edge of the yard. His tail was going that slow, steady rhythm. He was not looking at me, and he was not looking away from the tree line. I did not move either. I want to be accurate about this. There was no conscious decision to hold still, the same way there had been no conscious decision about the birdseed dish. My body simply stayed where it was, hands in my coat pockets, weight on both feet, the cold working through my barn coat at the shoulders and the back of my neck. The creature turned its head, and I saw its eyes in the dying light. I have been looking for the right words for that moment for the better part of a year. The closest I can get is this. The eyes were not curious, and they were not threatening, and they were not the eyes of something that did not know I was there. They were the eyes of something that had known I was there for a long time, and had come now to the edge where I could see it, because it had decided the time for that was right. I cannot prove that interpretation. I am telling you what those eyes felt like. Then it moved toward the porch. Not fast, not the loping movement of a startled animal, but a deliberate walk across 20 feet of yard that it covered in 4 strides, and each stride was long and unhurried, and Burl stayed where he was, and his tail kept its rhythm, and I stayed where I was at the railing with the dish beside me. It stopped at the foot of the porch steps. The porch is 3 steps up from the yard. The creature's head was level with my chest, even from the foot of the steps, and I am 6 feet tall, and I am telling you that, because I want you to understand the scale of the thing, I was standing close enough to hear it breathe, which was a slow sound, steady and deep, like a bellows working in a cold barn. It reached out one hand. I need to tell you about this carefully, because the careful telling is the whole point of everything I have said up to here. The hand moved to the dish, the shallow brown glazed clay dish that Della had bought at a church sale 9 years ago, and set on that railing because she had read that birds needed the fat from the seeds before the cold settled in. The creature's hand was large enough that 3 fingers and a thumb were sufficient to cup the dish from below without knocking it from the railing. And what it did with those fingers was not take the dish away and not tip the seeds out. What it did was rearrange the seeds that were already in the dish. It pressed the seed into the clay in a pattern that ran from the center outward, spoke by spoke, the way a child draws a sun, and it worked with a deliberateness that I have been trying to find the right word for since December, and the best word I have is care. It worked with care. When it was finished, it held the dish for a moment, and then set it back on the railing exactly where it had been. Then it looked at me. I felt something loosen in my chest. There is no other way to say it that stays true. Not a dramatic loosening, not the kind of thing that produces tears though my eyes were wet. I noticed that afterwards. Just a slow release of something that had been held at compression since late October, the way a timber frame joint settles after years of load. Something that had been carrying itself at tension finally trusted the ground enough to ease. I do not know how long we stood there. Long enough that the pewter sky had gone dark at the edges and the first stars were beginning to show above the ridgeline. Long enough that the cold had worked all the way through my coat. Burl had come up the steps at some point and was sitting beside my left boot, pressed against my ankle. Then the creature turned. Not abruptly. It turned the way it had walked, with that deliberate, unhurried quality, and it walked back across the yard toward the tree line, 4 strides. And I watched it go, and it reached the tree line and did not pause at the edge. It simply walked into the dark between the trees and was gone. There was no sound. That is what I kept coming back to in the minutes after it left. For something of that size, moving into dry December undergrowth, there was no sound that I could hear. Just the cold and the first stars, and Burl pressing against my ankle, and the dish on the railing with its careful pattern of seed. I stayed on the porch for a while after. I am not a man who sits with feelings easily. I have said as much already, but I want to be specific about what I mean. When Della died, the grief did not come in the way I had been led to expect from the movies and the condolence cards, the great wave of it. It came sideways. It came as the kitchen being too large, and the wrong side of the bed, and my hand going to the seed bag each evening. It came as 34 years of a life built with a particular person suddenly not having a foundation anymore, and me continuing to operate on the surface of a structure that had lost its underlying support. That was what October had been, and what November had been, and what the first 2 weeks of December had been. Standing on that porch in the dark with Burl against my ankle and the dish on the railing and the stars coming in over the ridgeline, I felt the loss of her differently than I had since she died. I felt it as something the world had witnessed, as something that had been seen from the edge of the trees, from whatever angle those dark, calm eyes had been watching from, across however many evenings of the dish being filled, and the light failing, and a man doing the one thing that connected him to the person who was gone. I cannot explain why that changed something in me, and I am not going to try. I went inside at some point. I do not remember making the choice to go in. Burl followed me, and I gave him his supper, and stood in the kitchen for a while, and then I went to bed, and slept in a way I had not slept since October, which is to say, completely. The next morning, Friday the 15th of December, I made coffee and I stood at the kitchen counter, and I picked up the phone. May answered on the 3rd ring. She sounded like she always does when she answers my calls, a little braced, waiting for the bad news she has been quietly expecting since October. "Hey, May," I said. "Dad, you okay?" I held the phone for a moment. "I wanted to call," I said. I should have called more, I know that. I know I've been." I stopped. "Dad." "I'm okay," I said. "I'm going to be okay, I think. I wanted you to know that." There was a pause on her end. Not the worried kind, the other kind. "I've been thinking about coming up," she said. "Not just after the New Year. Maybe before Christmas." I said that would be fine. I said that would be more than fine. We talked for 26 minutes, which was longer than we had talked in one call since the week Della died. I do not know what unlocked in me between that Thursday evening on the porch and that Friday morning on the phone. I cannot draw a clean line between the two things. I can tell you that something that had been preventing the call, not a decision, but a compression, had released overnight, and in the morning the call was possible in a way it had not been before. May came up on the 22nd of December and stayed through Christmas. She brought a casserole dish of something her husband Frank had made because she knew I had not been cooking, and she did not say anything about that directly, and I appreciated the care in the indirection. We ate at the kitchen table, both of us, which was the first time I had sat at the kitchen table for a meal since October. On the second evening she was there, I took her out to the porch at 4:30, and I filled the dish from the paper bag in the cabinet above the refrigerator and I set it on the railing. May looked at the dish for a moment. She knew what it was. She had grown up watching her mother do this. You kept it going, she said. Yeah, I said. She didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't either, and we stood on the porch in the cold while the last of the December light went flat and grey over the hardwoods. Burl sat on the step between us with his ears forward and his nose working the cold air, and the three of us watched the yard until the dark came in from the tree line. I have not seen the creature since the 14th of December. I have not seen the tracks again. I cannot tell you what it was or where it came from or why it came to the edge of my property on those November nights and took the seed from that dish in the particular way it took it, without scatter, without disturbing the glaze, whole and careful. I have thought about those things. I have sat with the various explanations and I have found none of them satisfying, and I have made my peace with that, more or less. What I can tell you is smaller and more specific than an explanation. By the time February came, the seed was going again some mornings. Not all mornings, 3 or 4 times in a week, when the temperature had been low enough overnight to make it worthwhile to come far out from the timber, maybe. I did not investigate it directly. I filled the dish each evening at 4:30, which has been the time of day since Della set that clay dish on the railing 9 years ago. And some mornings the dish was full, and some mornings it was not, and I let that be what it was. May called more regularly after Christmas. Not every day, not in the way that would feel like monitoring, but in the way that feels like contact, which is the thing I had been missing and the thing I had been failing to reach toward on my end. I started answering more. I started calling first sometimes, which I had not done in years. The first time I called her before she called me, she picked up, and there was a half-second pause before she said anything, just long enough for me to hear that it mattered. Ray came out in January with that trail camera he had offered. I told him I didn't think I needed it. He gave me a look that said he had expected that answer and had come anyway, which is the kind of brother-in-law Ray is. We sat on the porch in our coats for a while with coffee, both of us watching the tree line, and I told him most of what I've told you here. Not all of it. The part about the eyes I kept back, because some things are harder to say out loud than others, and I was not sure Ray's framework for the world had room for it. "You're not scared," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said. He nodded. He is a man who knows how to sit with information he can't categorize, which is one of the reasons he was able to be useful to me in that year. He finished his coffee and he didn't push me on the trail camera, and he drove home, and I was glad he had come. Spring is coming now. The hardwoods are still bare, but the mud has come back, and the first red-winged blackbirds showed up on the property last week, which means the season is turning the way it always does, without asking permission from anyone. The birdseed dish is still on the railing. I fill it every evening at 4:30, the way Della started doing 9 years ago, and the way I have been doing since the October she died, not because I decided to, but because that is the time, and that is the ritual, and that is the dish. I'm not a man who was built to believe in things he can't explain. I want to say that plainly, one more time, because it matters to the telling. I spent 31 years on a rural route where the world was mostly explicable, where weather had patterns and roads had conditions, and things that needed doing had clear procedures. I am precise about machinery and about land and about the specific behavior of animals I have had the chance to observe over years. I do not embellish, and I do not perform, and I am aware, having told this story to a small number of people, that it sounds like something a man in a hard winter might construct for his own comfort. I have thought about that. I have thought about it carefully, the way I would think about a discrepancy in a route log that didn't add up. And what I keep coming back to is this. The dish was arranged. The seed was pressed into the glaze in a deliberate pattern, spoke by spoke, the way a child draws a sun. And I did not do it, and no animal I know of does that with its food, and the pattern was still there in the morning when I came out to fill it again, and I stood and looked at it for a long time before I went inside. That is what I know for certain. Everything else I have told you, the size, the eyes, the deliberateness, the way Burl sat calm and steady through all of it, that I am telling you as accurately as I can. But I am aware it is one man's account of one evening on a 12-acre piece of land in the mountains, and you will make of it what you make of it. What I made of it was a phone call the next morning. What I made of it was a different relationship with the kitchen table and with the 26 minutes I have not wasted since. What I made of it was the understanding that Della's ritual had not ended when Della did, that the thing she had begun every evening at 4:30 had continued past her, through me and out into the dark of the yard and into the trees, and that something on the other side of that dark had been receiving it. The coda on all of this is a small one. It is late February as I tell it. The temperature this evening was 29 degrees, and the sky was clear, and there were enough stars to see the ridge by. I filled the dish at 4:30 and went back inside, and an hour later I opened the door to let Burl out before bed. He went down the porch steps and stood at the edge of the yard with his nose up, and his tail going that slow, steady rhythm, and I stood in the doorway watching him. After a minute he came back up the steps and sat down beside my left boot and leaned against my ankle, the way he does. I don't know what he smelled out there. I did not see anything in the tree line. The dish in the morning was empty, the railing clean, the glaze undisturbed. I left it empty for most of the day. Then at 4:30 I went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, and I took down the paper bag and I filled the dish. And Burl came out with me and sat on the step, and the yard was quiet, and the dark came in slow and steady from the tree line the way it does this time of year. And I stood at the railing in the cold and I let it.